Thank you so much again, Liz. And thank you, of course, to Chris and everyone for having me back. It was a real pleasure to present with you to y'all last year and to attend the talks. It's been a really captivating way to learn more about conservation across different parts of the African landscape. I just want to give you a couple disclaimers. I'm sorry, I'm recovering from a sinus infection, so I do my best to keep coughing to a minimum, and hopefully you can hear me okay. And then also we have a small, somewhat deranged kitten running around that's just found screens like a toddler, so she'll find this giant computer screen eventually. Today I want to talk to you all about what counts in 21st century conservation. It's a topic that I covered a bit last time, and in this talk, I'm going to really expand upon what we discussed last year, which was really thinking about reshifting our focus and approach to conservation. And today, I'm particularly talking about primates, as that's where a lot of my training is rooted. I have tried my best to put the photo credits and artwork credits and things like that throughout the presentation. You'll see why when we get closer to the education part of the talk. Just to let you know a little bit about where we're going today, I'm going to talk first very briefly about what is the problem, so to speak, in 21st century primate conservation. This is something that will be not new information for a lot of the primate folks in the room. Will be a bit of a recap. It's some higher level data about what primates are facing presently in on the planet and what some of the major threats are, et cetera. And then moving on to how we engage this problem. Last year, I talked a lot about examining narratives of science and sustainability in the context of primate conservation. Well, in the context of conservation in general. Oh, sorry, did that go out? There we go. And how narratives of sustainability and conservation either gain or lose traction in the current climates. And then look at how we respond to problems in primate conservation within the discipline of primatology, within broader publics, at global and local scales. And then talk about how we can shift our focus just slightly in current times to really take our practice further, I guess. How we can engage different sources of data, how we can use data to better support some of our arguments, and then bringing environmental education and advocacy to the forefront of what we do. So in this slide is just a very basic graphic taken from a paper that was published in 2017. The data on the status of the world's primates have certainly been updated since 2017, but one of the reasons why I have often cited this article when I was teaching in the classroom or giving public talks is because I like that it really brings together, at least even if you just look at the author's list, shows how a number of scientists work together to amass a critical amount of information to really demonstrate what an impending extinction crisis would mean for the world's non-human primates, and try to, at a very sort of accessible level, communicate to broader publics through a wider ranging publication why primates matter. For those of you that are less up to date on your primate statistics, right? Non-human primates, of course, includes humans, are the third most species-rich order of mammals on the planet, behind rodents and bats. And at present, more than 65% of the world's primates are threatened with extinction. That's based on using classifications from IUCN websites, which can vary from critically endangered, possibly extinct, threatened, vulnerable, et cetera. A lot of you will be familiar with those classifications from the different species that you work with in your own practice. One thing that I often encourage people to take away from this slide is looking at the breadth of the geographic distribution of primates. Oftentimes people will hone in on the fact, and if you read the article, that a large number of primates are found in a few countries in the world, right? DRC, Brazil, Madagascar being, three of the top primate host countries. And it's no surprise, right, that non-human primates share habitats with people, right? There's really no place on the planet that's been untouched by what we call anthropogenic disturbance or human-driven disturbance, right? And in the early days of primatology, the search for a pristine landscape within which to study our non-human primate relatives, it became clear quite quickly that that's not necessarily an option, right? There are very few, well, really, there are no habitats on the earth that have not been touched or impacted by anthropogenic disturbance, particularly when we're considering climate change and very large scale global shifts. Understanding the relationships between humans and non-human primates in anthropogenic landscapes or across the planet writ large is important to me as a primatologist, and hopefully important to all of you as fellow primates, because our ability to understand our own place in this world is dependent on the relational existence of these species. And I think it's one reason why primatology is a bit different. Maybe different isn't the right word, or unique isn't the right word, but why there's a little bit of a different history of the way primatologists have engaged in conservation. And I'll come to that in a moment. Primates are seed dispersers, pollinators, and much of what exists on this planet is dependent upon non-human primates as well as other species. However, any protection of non-human primates or any conservation space is complicated and requires holistic, biological, ecological, and even cosmological understandings of the environment. But these are necessary in order to find ways to move forward for both humans and non-human primates. When we talk about, and I'll just stay on this slide for just one moment, when I'm talking about in primatology, how we approach conservation, there are different sort of ways, right, that science has taken shape. Conservation biology emerged as a discipline in the mid-1980s as a response, or a dynamic discipline in response to potential global extinction crises and environmental change. Primatology, of course, has always been positioned within conservation, but it also seeks to achieve a lot of other outcomes, right? Primate studies and primatology, of course, are critical for our understanding of our own evolution as a taxonomic order. It's important for understanding captive management. There's conservation, there's inherent understandings of the way that people engage with non-human primates, as the example that I think Judith was giving in the opening about how perceptions of primates in South African landscapes differ quite dramatically from the way primates may be viewed in Western forested landscapes, for example, as pests versus natural animals or non-pests, right? These negative positive relationships. And so in primate studies, right, conservation is something that's inherently part of what we do, but it's also driven, there's also the underlying fact when you're thinking about academic research in primatology of a desire or a necessity to understand the behavior of these species on the planet as it informs our understanding of ourselves and animal behavior more broadly. So what's the problem that we're facing in 21st century conservation and arguably have been facing for decades? It was interesting in sort of rereading some of the older literature for this talk today. I was reminded of how comments regarding sustainability of hunting, sustainability of agricultural practice, long-term trajectories for non-human primates and other wildlife have consistently been, probably for the last 50 years, written about in academic literature as being unsustainable, that there's an end in sight. And yet it's complicated to convey that message to broader publics when we're repeating the same message decade after decade, with little change in the way we engage our practice. So one of the main problems for non-human primates in the context where I work, and I will be clear, I'm focusing mostly on West and Central Africa. I know there are some other primatologists on the call I would reference you to for some other areas. But importantly, we have to think about that global trades in forest resources, hunting, political instability, agricultural expansion, and barriers to socioeconomic health and well-being for local communities have direct impacts on biodiversity and local human populations. The typical pattern for this is, of course, declining biodiversity and increasing impacts, generally negative, rarely neutral, sometimes positive outcomes for local human communities. And looking at the interplay between those is really important in understanding best practices in conservation, how we can have sort of the ultimate goal of a win-win where there's a stemming loss of biodiversity and also non-negative impacts for the local communities who are dependent on wildlife. I would draw your attention to the infographic, which I'm looking at it on the right. I imagine you are too. Let's hope my sinus infected mind has got that correct. Designed by one of our interns, Alana Hyman, looking at sort of demonstrating that in wildlife economies, you have a lot of interplay between urban markets, cultural preferences, hunting technology, logging, industrial agriculture. And these are really more local driving factors. I would encourage us to think, stepping back out from this, how global factors also play into this. Of course, there's global demands for wildlife products. There's convergence of other trafficked items. There are, of course, industrial agriculture. For those of us working in West and Central Africa and Southeast Asia are very well aware of the effects of industrial agricultural oil palm expansion for non-human primates, excuse me. So think about how when we're talking about impacts on local communities, we have to look at the interplay between logging, hunting, cultural practice, industrial agriculture, and markets, but also how that fits in a global scale. And these are topics that primatologists, conservation biologists have been engaging with since for years, right? I think, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the dates now, but when in the early 2000s, when we started referring to the bushmeat crisis, right, as a crisis of a wildlife economy, researchers really started taking stock of some of these issues and trying to look at the interplay between them. It's very difficult to address any one aspect of a wildlife economy without looking at this broader picture. A really great example, when I've been talking to students in the past about cultural preferences, to think about the importance of wild meat in the diet, is where we work in southwestern Cameroon. In many ways, for example, the words for meat are worked into the names of animals, right? So that there's not a divide between wildlife and food or human animal. So for example, the porcupine, right, is often referred to in southwestern Cameroon as chuku chuku beef, right? And so in its very name, it's implied that it's part of your consumptive process. Nyama, which is the word in Sango for animal, it is also the word for animal in a number of different Central African dialects, is also worked into daily food practices and discussions of food and animal being the same thing. And so we have to really think about these complexities. So with this in mind, right, primatologists began expanding their practice to not only be looking at behavior and how we can understand human evolution through understandings of non-human primate behavior, but also looking at how we can shift what we do to have greater impacts on the protection of the primates of which we study. So where are we now? Well, I would hazard to guess that every primatologist on this call would say that we're pretty much still experiencing the same problem, but now we've uncovered additional layers. which is the case with the scientific process. And I think it's these additional layers which have made it possible for primate researchers and conservation biologists to really think more deeply about the interconnectedness of what's happening in wildlife economies, and to begin to tease apart some of the places where we might be able to have the greatest impact. So food insecurity, for example, my colleague Liz Hall, who introduced me, and myself and Melissa Remus have been looking at food insecurity with regard to access to wildlife and forest resources in the Central African Republic. I would point you also to some really excellent work by Dr. Courtney Bergeson and her team in Madagascar, looking at relationships between food insecurity and protein alternatives in Madagascar to reduce lemur hunting. Now, when we're talking about food insecurity, the introduction of alternative proteins is a very complex topic, and not one that a lot of primatologists are necessarily willing to promote. However, I think the work in Madagascar is a really excellent example of ethnographically, socially science-based work within a public health framework that's really found a good path forward for those communities. In other areas of the world where protein alternatives have been introduced, they've often been less successful for various reasons, right? And now conservation practice and primatologists have been able to look more deeply into sort of better informed approaches to engagement in this area, which leads into health and nutrition and an emerging infectious disease, which of course has been a big topic in the last years, with the fact that we're all living through a global pandemic and thinking a lot about wildlife markets, right? There's not been one health presentation in the last years that's not addressed whether or not there should be bans, limitations on wet markets. Of course, I'm happy to tell you that my stance is that a ban on wet markets is not the appropriate course forward. But I think what's important is that we're having these discussions now in the context, right, of a post-COVID world, of thinking about why markets are important to people at various levels, right? That there's local demand and global demand, and how we have to address one differently than the other when we're talking about putting food on the table of a community member versus a globally driven trade. And so there is a lot of nuance there that's kept us in the same problem, but we're working to better understand it now through a different lens, and the engagement in One Health, the intersection between public health and primatology, infectious and emerging zoonotic diseases, and a number of different topics that have given a lot more light to some of the issues that we're working on. We're also facing loss of cultural practices and knowledge, and this is something that's been brought forth a lot for other species, particularly aquatic life, and thinking about climate change, but also with the context of loss of non-human primates and other species, in terms of what role those individuals play in passing on a vertical knowledge transmission as well as horizontal knowledge transmission. And then, of course, we have expanding markets and convergent patterns of wildlife crime. And this, of course, the last two are something more that when I'm wearing my Chingetta hat, we focus on quite extensively, of thinking about how convergence in wildlife crime can exacerbate issues surrounding bushmeat markets, the trade in wild animal meat, and the trade in wild animal parts and live primates. So not really uplifting to think about how, after decades of research, we're still in the same problem, still facing the same problem of continued primate declines, particularly in West and Central Africa. The greatest threat to primates is hunting. This would be different than in South America, where you have a lot of industrial cattle ranching and things like that are greater threats for non-human primates and other forested species. But I think what is positive here is the engagement across disciplines to really acknowledging and teasing apart some of these more complex issues that we have to be addressing. So how might we address it ourselves in the context of this talk today when we leave? And this is something I brought up last year, and I will never pass up a moment to reiterate it, is that we have to include diverse voices in conservation. It can't just be myself as a primatologist or anthropologist It can't just be the herpetologist that's also there. It can't just be the epidemiologist. When we're looking at examining all aspects of a forested system that are affecting long-term primate conservation, whether it's a One Health approach or another approach, we have to understand fully the ebb and flow of forest life for people, for non-human primates, for decomposers, for fungi, for plants, and that can't be done alone. It has to be done through collaboration. And this is with local counterparts, diverse stakeholders, government partners, from the top to the bottom, right? And so that's one approach we've always taken in Chingeta, is working with locally based solutions that are rooted in other, in collaborations with the government ministries, so that we're meeting those points all the way down. And that has to be done through the planning, the implementation, the assessment, the restitution. And then when we start again at the top, it's the same thing down and down and down. We have to be dynamic. And I admit that even for myself, this is a difficult one, to change the way we do practice. It's difficult, particularly when many primatologists are either working in an NGO sector, where we're tied to funding, to meeting the daily needs of our organizations, or into an academic sector where we're also still meeting all those obligations, training students in the next generation, and also publishing, right? It's hard to shift what we're doing when we're also sort of bounded within the confines of a discipline that's not changing as fast as our work is demanding. And so my hat's off to all conservationists who are working in this. Is it's difficult to be pushing through those systems, and we're still doing it. So collaboration, dynamism are key to reimagining the systems and the primates we seek to protect. The particular reason why on this slide I used artwork by an associate, Will Eskridge, is Will, right, has not had done a lot of work on bat conservation, but not necessarily on primate conservation. And so in working with other artists, I see the way that they envision or they understand primate behavior through what they learn around them, right? So as practitioners, as tourists, as guides, as rangers, we have to think every day about reimagining the systems we seek to protect. So how can we do that? I can lecture to you about it once a year, but I need to offer you some solutions. We can change the way we view data and collaboration, and we can do that slowly. It's not an overnight process, and we have to make education and advocacy a part of our toolkit. As primatologists, as rangers, as just the person interested in primates, you can also take these tasks on, right? You don't have to be, have an official position as someone who works in primatology or as a PhD in animal behavior to begin working on some of these issues. Okay, so let's think about what counts now in 21st century conservation. And I will say that, of course, these are my own personal opinions. And they do reflect some of the missions that I work with, and I'll give you some examples of my projects as well as those of my colleagues. So let's talk about data. You've seen this slide from me before, perhaps in different talks. Thinking about what traditionally counts as data in primatology is one thing that has always really interested me, and in wildlife studies in general. We often think about here, wildlife sightings, diker dung, right? I did my whole PhD looking for diker dung every day, maybe sighting a diker, having a conversation with an individual, right? These are all things that are quantifiable, that can ask and answer and help us interrogate our research hypotheses, but we have to be really open to other ways of addressing those additional layers. So up here on the top right, you see some dried blood spot cards. This is one other way, right, that we might be able to investigate food insecurity, emerging infectious disease, and the relationships between conservation, public health, and the long-term sustainability of primate populations and the sustainability of local livelihoods. If we can find ways to use different methodologies, right, like biomedical approaches, to safely and effectively shift our understanding of the way of the complex relationships between humans and wildlife. We can do this through conversations with individuals, ethnographic interviews, and of course, a deeper understanding of the oral histories and traditions of the communities with whom we work. Excuse me. So all these types of data, right, can really inform what we're doing. And I think one of the most undersung types of data is that we just have from existing in these landscapes ourselves. When I'm working, for example, with rangers from Changetta Wildlife and trainers and talking to them about community relationships and perceptions of primates and wildlife and how people are meeting their daily needs. A lot of times individuals are uncomfortable using reflexive data from their day-to-day life. But really, I would argue that the researcher themselves, the trainer, the ranger, the guide, have an unending amount of exceptional data that really fill out some of the story when we're looking at primate conservation. And that's a really important part of the ethnographic process. It's becoming more and more mainstreamed in primatology, which has been excellent, and moving more so into conservation biology of the importance of ethnographic and socially based data collection, but also that use of sort of the years of participant observation that a researcher themselves has done to really fill out some of these unanswered areas or sort of grayer areas in our work. So what counts as data? We have to be open to more, right? We have to be open to diverse types, to engaging with other academics or practitioners who can help us to realize some of these methods. What also counts as data, and this is something that, of course, I know will pique the interest of Rod, as we've talked about it several times, is what is a sighting? Thinking about when we're trying to document the last remaining members of certain populations on this planet or looking for new species, what counts as documentation of the existence or non-existence of a species, right? So really, I think a lot of when I'm talking to students and researchers about what is a sighting, and as someone who specializes in red colobus monkeys, there's two great examples here. Some of you may be familiar with Miss Waldron's red colobus that was once classified as extinct, and then data from in Ivory Coast, primarily from the early 2000s, some photographs of pelts from hunters have been the only sort of documentation, despite repeated survey efforts, to find Miss Waldron's red colobus existing in the within its last known range. Right, we've decided, the powers that be, that these observations of pelts and photographs are enough to remove it from the extinction category, and has now sort of been reclassified in the IUCN. An example from the species that I work with, Ms. Preuss's red colobus, just Preuss's red colobus, Paleocolobus prussi. And the range of this species, right, it's primarily found, there's a stronghold of the population in Korup National Park, but across its range, we've relied quite heavily on data from hunters to document its potential existence in other non-protected areas, such as the Ebo Forest, Ta'ali, in north of Korup in Southwest Cameroon. And that's where we've really had to get some of the data on the potential range of this species, right? And these are from community observations. These are some of the only existing data for many important species. So we have to ask ourselves, does it count? Of course, for me, absolutely. I'm thrilled to say that in the recent action plan, I should hold it up so I don't get in trouble. The action for forgetting about it, the action plan for red colobus conservation for 2021-2026 includes community observation data and photographic evidence of some of Ms. Waldron's red colobus as important markers of the potential existence of these really rare primates in certain parts of their range. What also counts in data are collaboration, right? And this is the sort of the last part of this before we cruise on through to education. I want to give you an example of how collaboration outside of other academics, other researchers, other practitioners are important. And that comes from our work in the Central African Republic with local registered gun hunters. This work was part of my PhD work in 2008, 2009, where I worked with over 200 hunters across different technologies, including wire snares, artisanal guns, and registered guns, and examined the hunting offtake from 793 trips over about a 30-week period. Why is this important? Is because, right, hunters are quite often portrayed as eco-baddies, right, as one researcher, Axel Kohler, had put it, thinking about as villains, right, of individuals that we're working against when we're in wildlife protection and conservation. And that's absolutely a narrative that we have to dismantle and break down. We're working with communities to create lasting sustainability of wildlife populations, and people rely on wildlife differently than I engage with wildlife, and that's an important part of the puzzle. So we spent a lot of time during my PhD engaging with hunters, even those individuals who are engaging in illegal technologies, to understand the process with which they hunt to meet their daily needs and to find ways to remove barriers, right, to daily life that lead them to make choices to engage in illegal activity. Right. In my PhD work finished in 2009. Of course, we continued analyzing the data with my research assistant who's featured there, Eugene Mabea. And the data were presented back to the community for a better understanding of what was happening in their forests. I'm really thrilled to say that in 2020 and 2021, while working with Chingetta and Liz Hall, who's on the call, that the same group of hunters reached out to Chingetta to start a collaborative self-reporting survey to better understand the way they're using the forests around them. And this has been a really important partnership. We have to date 30 weeks of data with 281 trips. Of course, I'm not presenting the results of this here because we're still in analysis, but you'll note, right, that the decade before, around the same time frame, right, 30 weeks, there's a significant difference in the number of trips. There's been a significant decline. Of course, the sample size is slightly different, but there's a lot of potential comparability between these 2 years to look at what's changed. Has hunting technology changed? Have prey populations declined? What can we say about the way that this group of hunters who are legally accessing the forest are meeting their daily needs? Right, so here's an example where the collaboration in an unlikely area is critical to conservation. And I put down at the bottom, what do we gain? But I think the better question or statement is, what do we lose by not doing these collaborations? And the answer is quite a bit, if not everything, right? The real understanding of what's happening in a forest comes from those individuals who are relying upon it for their livelihood. We have to be very clear of the differences between subsistence hunting, commercial illegal hunting, and larger scale trades in pangolin and ivory scales. But to understand any part of that continuum, we have to start somewhere, right? And through a self-reporting survey where individuals do report if they are in the wrong location where they're not supposed to be, if they've perhaps taken a protected species, right? There is honesty and clarity in that data, and there's a real partnership there and looking at better at shifting the way that individuals are meeting their needs, because there's a shared acknowledgement of a need for a future for both wildlife and communities. So rather than in your own field sites thinking about what we might gain from working more closely with hunters, think about what's lost if we don't, I think is a better way to frame it. Okay, so what counts? Education and advocacy. And this is, sorry, I got distracted I got distracted to thinking about data and conservation, but I want to spend a little bit of time here before I open it up to questions. So, of course, my engagement in primate education and environmental education comes a lot from working on red colobus monkeys as a result of the, this is not quite the updated picture that I showed you here, right? The red colobus action plan for 2021 and 2026. But this action plan was one of the first for a group of African monkeys. And it has within its top guidelines, right, a commitment to education and engage and awareness, which I think is a really important component of what we're doing when we're thinking about primate conservation. So this is just a graphic made by one of our interns of the range of red colobus. I'm primarily focusing in these education programs on Preuss's red colobus and Temminck's red colobus. So as Liz said, I'm the co-founder of Partners for Red Colobus. We're myself, Alexander Hoffner, pictured down here on the left, and our colleague, Dr. Joshua Linder, established this as a way to provide a framework for conservation and outreach planning across the range of red colobus species. It very quickly expanded into other species. Oops, excuse me. But we work to focus on education materials, supporting outreach activities in collaboration with local organizations. On the bottom, there was one of our first engagements with a group of 150 young kids who came to a nature club at the Limbe Wildlife Center to learn more about Preuss's red colobus, which is endemic to this part of Cameroon. One of the things that's really critical, right, when we're thinking about environmental education as part of the toolkit for primate conservation is it can't be optional anymore. And a lot of conservation grants and research grants, you can tack on at the end an extra $500 if you're engaging in an education activity or capacity building activity. And what's really difficult about that is it often means that in practice, for researchers, for management, education falls to the back. And it really, it's difficult, right? Because we say, you think, right, by going out and sensitizing, we are educating, but we have to have very focused efforts at thinking about how education across stakeholder levels is a critical part of primate, of primate conservation. So one thing we've been really focusing on at Partners for Red Colobus, and there are a number of really excellent organizations that are doing this as well, that I would, maybe Liz can type them in the notes. There's Little Fireface Project by Dr. Anna Nakaris. Dr. Pat Wright has an exceptional history of primate education at Ranamafana. And so I would also point you to those, but of course I'm biased to Red Colobus. So when we're talking about environmental education, it has to be a focal point in our work, and we have to find ways to make it a focal point as much as we can, right? If that's engaging with local primary and secondary school teachers, different stakeholders that can help us as primatologists or conservationists to support that, that's a way forward. The work has to be culturally grounded and locally relevant. So here again is a place where social science and ethnographic research can really better inform the way we're engaging in education practices, right? Making topics relevant across, age 5 to 15 is difficult, right? And teachers know how to do that, to make those, to shift that material. What they need from us generally is the material, right? We can provide them with one level of a storybook or a platform, and then we're guided by the teachers themselves and how to adjust that for different age types. It has to be multimodal, right? We're thinking about different levels of literacy, visual literacy, thinking in whether individuals are literate in numbers, reading, different ways to engage audiences, right? Of course, children are taking these materials home to their parents, which of course are different educational backgrounds. So how can we get the most from the materials we can create? And it's often difficult, but I would encourage anyone in management or engaging in education programming to find a way to do a pre and post assessment of the materials that you're working with. Be open to the fact that they're working or they're not working, right? And that you may need to shift what you're doing. And I find that children are very clear in what's working or not working for them. And then, of course, this has to be integrated through programming at both project and institutional levels. At Partners for Red Colobus, we work with with school teachers, but also working with individuals at the protected areas level, right? Who in the park management staff could also be learning this material to be training other individuals, right? To be helping to disseminate it, to be reporting if there's a difficulty with one of the outputs of an education project. Here's an example just to show you some of the possibility of a project we've just finished in Cameroon with the program for PSMNR, the Program for the Sustainable Management of Natural Resources Southwest Region, and the Ministry of Forests and Waters in Cameroon, right? So this is a multi-sided project where this means that we have a base educational center at the Limbe Botanic Garden that they've created, the Integrated Conservation and Education Center. And it's multi-sided in that across 5 protected areas, cluster facilitators who do a lot of the work for the protected area itself have engaged with local school teachers to disseminate materials at primary and secondary school levels. So you have site visits of students into the center to learn about flagship species. Of course, you might see just from this image here that while we have some flagship species of the gorilla, the Nigeria Cameroon chimpanzee, the mainland drill, taking an ecosystem approach, we get as many other animals in there as we can. You can see a pangolin up there on the left, the red-capped mangabey, trying to get the most out of an experience for children. We provide different manuals that have different sort of games. Here's an ecosystem game where the students all identify as an individual in the ecosystem, and everyone has their card. And then of course something happens and maybe the monkey is removed from the system and you see how the web collapses. And here's Allie down here on a site visit. A lot of work for a lot of reward, right? In different ways of engaging individuals. So here in the center, we're getting children and adults, right? So you're really reaching across the range. Just some other areas that we've worked before. I'm going to highlight one last project. We're currently collaborating on a project in southwestern Niger Delta Forest Project for the Niger Delta red colobus and the Tana River red colobus. And we've been extremely fortunate at Partners for Red Colobus to work with Communities for Red Colobus project in the Gambia. And they have, with their permission, allowed me to share a little bit about what they do for individuals who are interested in some of their work. So Communities for Red Colobus works with local communities to secure tenic red colobus populations in line with the priorities of the Red Colobus Action Plan. Now, in their work, they build initiatives, do primate monitoring and research, and are also really focused on alternative livelihood projects such as ecotourism. And we've been really fortunate to have opportunities to collaborate with C4RC and to learn from their team featured down here on the left, an incredible group of dedicated individuals. And this has been shared courtesy of Dr. McMahue, who's at University of Cumbria. And just to show you some images from their work, thanks again to McMahue for the images. And he gave me some of their successes to share with you of how education and outreach has been effective for this part of the Gambia, even in really challenging COVID times. So C4RC has class-based teaching at 2 schools with several hundred pupils a week. One of the teachers, Meta, has been a tireless warrior for education during COVID, sometimes teaching just a few students at a time and cycling them through. It's been really incredible. They've got a wildlife club with 50 children and teens participating weekly in field-based activities. They have a ranger training program with 9 teenagers and young adults meeting weekly as part of a 6-month structured program. They just recently did a drive for World Ranger Day that you may have seen some of you on social media. There are women's groups and elders groups that have monthly meetings to learn about local wildlife, particularly Temminck's red colobus, and of course a C4RC football team. At Partners for Red Colobus and Communities for Red Colobus, we find that football teams and community engagement processes are always a big hit and opportunities for reaching a variety of individuals. Through a lot of their work, you can see here, they've been able to engage in different forms of small level tourism with individuals. And I would really encourage you, if you're interested in some of the ways that smaller scale work can have great impacts on local livelihoods through small scale ecotourism, to reach out to them at C4RC Project, or I can connect you afterwards. I'd be happy to. They're doing incredible work. So those are just a couple of examples of the ways that education can really be the next step in what we're doing. It's oftentimes not as sexy, but it's often it's the longest lasting and the most effective, right? And it's somewhere we need to sort of really be shifting our focus in conservation to reaching to a broader audience, and to reaching the audience that we need the most, which is engaging with local communities. And the last thing I would just highlight is advocacy and action. And of course, that's difficult and means a lot of things in current times, but I just want us to think about the ways that we can, as individuals, guides, rangers, conservation enthusiasts, be a part of some of these changes, whether it's through participating in education programs, through reviewing documents, through science communication. There are a number of different ways that people can be involved. And when I was preparing for this talk, one sort of area where I think all of us who are on this call could really be involved is something that the IUCN section for human primate interactions has been working on. And so I just wanted to highlight that here as one very concrete way that we can all do something. So this is a subsection of the IUCN Primate Specialist Group established in 2017, co-chaired by Dr. Sean Waters and Dr. Malin Fries Hansen. I think there's some other folks on this call who are part of this. Please chime in if you would like to. The areas of focus within the group are on exploitation, tourism, trade, agroecosystem, urban primates, and primates and cultures. And there's been a lot of webinars that have been given that you can also find on, I think, through the social media channels that may be of interest to some of you on this call. But what I wanted to draw our attention to was the best practice guidelines for responsible images of non-human primates. This is a very short, accessible document that's been translated to more than 20 languages when I counted yesterday, that takes step-by-step approach to understanding how we can further conservation through responsible photography of non-human primates. And this is at a tourism level, at a practitioner level. There are different ways of sort of discussing points in terms of how photos can harm non-human primates in ways that we don't think. And also, of course, rather than just telling you how we can sort of damage primates in conservation practice with photos, there are guidelines for how to take responsible images. And so I would really point you to those. Promoting education, ensure that you or your organization have a code of conduct for the dissemination of imagery by staff. If you are a primatologist, being sure that your primatology gear is in the photo, so it's very clear that you're a working individual, right? You've got your binoculars, your notepad, and that you're there doing something, that you maintain a minimum distance of 7 meters when you're in an image with a wild primate, and a number of other different topics. And so I would really encourage you to go there. And one very simple way to sort of be a part of the solution, which I always told my students during field trips, and I tell myself and our field teams at Chingetta every day, is every time you take a picture that has a wildlife or another individual in it, consider why you want that picture and what that picture is meant to do. And then think about the motive for the photo. And that will usually tell you if it's a responsible image of wildlife or of a local community member or not. And so I wanted to leave that there with you as an example for how practitioners and primatologists are working, right, to sort of better advocate for the species we work with, but also how we as people, right, can be a part of a solution. And then, of course, education is action at all levels. This is not necessarily, with school children at a field site. It's in our homes, right? And we had in one of our education campaigns, it was remember, learn, and grow, right? Think about the ways that you can make these small changes, whether it's in in a tourism sector, development sector, or management sector, right? That there are very small aspects of education that we can all sort of take a part in that support primate conservation in the 21st century. So what counts and what can I do? Well, those were it, right? Think of the small ways that we can engage, right? And another way, and the last thing I will leave you with that's been, that comes up quite common in conservation is to really consider the language we use, and even the imagery we use to talk about conservation. Says a lot about where we're going, right? And to remember that we have to include diverse voices, and so be the person in the room that asks for that other voice. I'm often the person in the room that nobody wants in the room, but that's why I should be there. Think about those things. Consider the way we're using imagery in tourism and in research and in conservation, right, itself. I wanted to just quickly put up some collaborations and gratitude from funders, supporters, of course, a list of all the individuals whose artwork I featured in this presentation, and then the people whose voices I carry in my work are featured there. I will stop talking at you now and open it for questions or discussions of how you might be able to incorporate education or advocacy or collaborative data into your own projects. And I also welcome anyone else on the call who's engaging in these to sort of to chime in with your own thoughts. And thank you again for having me.
Hi, Carolyn, you are a woman that's doing what I'm doing. Thank you. I've been working in a community for 21 years, and I have used the most amazing activities for various age groups. And I've been taking down notes tonight, and culturally grounded, I'm doing exactly the same thing, topics that are relevant. But I want to ask you, how are you approaching the education department to become more proactive in trying to integrate environmental education into the school curriculum? Because in South Africa, with our CAPS curriculum, it's very difficult. There is parts that have got some EE, but I'm trying to change that. And I've seen through my PhD that it does work. And you did say there is a way to find out if anybody has done a pre and post evaluation or an assessment. I did it in my PhD. I used a structured questionnaire for grade 3s, 7s, and 8s. And then I also used art. So art is one of the amazing things to try and find out how or what the child has actually taken in, and also what they enjoyed. I've made use of puppet shows, dramas, and I don't care the age, because I have found out, I'm also working with ladies and men. Sorry, I'm waffling off, I'm so excited. That puppet shows work with adults, it works for children, it works for all ages, dramas, stories. And I love the way you gain the literature way. Languages is important to try and get messages across. But yeah, just quickly, I'd just like to find out how you are approaching or trying to tackle the education department and how you're integrating EE into the curriculum.
Yeah, no, it's really difficult, right? And of course, all teachers already have their curriculum. So it's finding ways that you could insert something that's not going to become onerous for the teacher. And so some of we find, so in the one project where we've been more successful, we were very lucky that the primary and secondary school teachers were very receptive to it. And we did this first through offering, so I wish she could have been here today, but she was unable. Our collaborators at PSM&R, that in the Cameroon project, and Alexander Hoffner invited some of the school teachers to come to a workshop to see the materials, to engage with them, right, rather than showing up at a school and their setting and pressing it on them, right? So that it was a sort of, let's have a working meeting on how this might work for you or not. And then she created a list of all the options, right? So it's sort of the instructor, the teacher could pick and choose how they might work something into an existing curriculum, like the string game, right? I mean, most teachers that are teaching young children at some point, right? I remember Allie and I were actually watching a classroom where like slowly every child asked to go to the bathroom, and then all of a sudden they were all outside and there was no one in the classroom anymore. Right. So at those natural breaks where kids need a break, right, incorporating one of these types of activities then. So it's about slowly sort of finding ways that that it can fit in the curriculum without right, the teachers already have so many demands, and of course now in a COVID situation it's more so. So just offering small bits, right? Of course, it's as an enthusiast, you seem as enthusiastic like myself with education. I want to run and be like, here are all the things we can do, right? But you have to just give them a few.
Yes.
And then as they see it working and not taking away from right state-based curriculum, school systems become more open to it.
Carolyn, sorry, Chris, if I can just add, have you ever heard of the ESA organization? That's the Environmental Education Association of Southern Africa.
No, but I would be happy.
I need to get you linked.
Yeah.
We run that. I'm part of the council, and I think we need to get you more exposure to that.
Yeah, that would be great. I mean, okay. Honestly, at Partners for Red Columnists, we're just a few people that someone asked us to do this, and we'd all dabbled in it, and now it's what we're doing.
Yeah, because I see your target groups are very similar to what I've done. I've got eco warriors, which are the youth. I've got teachers. I've got the adults. I've got the school learners. And yeah, Karen, I'm going to ask Chris and them if they can just share your details with me so I can email you.
Yeah, sure.
And if we can just share knowledge and network, I think it'll be amazing. So I don't make the same mistakes and you don't make the same mistakes. And we just learn from each other. So let's try. As I said, I've been waffling on tonight, making notes like you won't believe. I felt like a first year student again, and I hope my students have been linked on tonight, because I'm definitely, if you don't mind, I am going to share your YouTube with my students. I think this is a must, and I think they need to learn from what you have done. Thank you. And you're doing amazing work.
Thanks so much. I appreciate the positive feedback, and I look forward to talking more.
Thank you.
Ruan, Chris here, I think we should just, I just want to mention that it started raining here in Libreville, and my signal is going from time to time. So I might drop out. So Ruan, you take over the questions and answers, please. I think Diana Pitney is the next one. All right.
Yes.
Then I'll give it totally to you. Thanks. All right.
Thank you very much, Chris. Diane, I'm asking you to unmute. There we go.
Thank you. Stuart, over to you. Sorry, Caroline, would you support the breeding of primates in captivity for conservation?
The breeding of primates in captivity for conservation. For conservation, how? If you could just expand a little bit. You mean like in zoos or for a...
No. In certain locations to breed them at captivity and then release them in the wild?
I mean, okay. So I would say no, right? I mean, to be honest, right? My initial thought is we can't manage the primates we have in the wild now. Why would we put more out there? It depends really on the context, right? Of course, there is the classic conservation example of the golden lion tamarin of a species that was saved from extinction in South America through release and reintroduction programs, right? The cost and the logistics that go into a reintroduction program are so enormous that it's very difficult to find examples of where it works well. And this comes up a lot in primate conservation classes. I wish I had the paper to mind, but I always think of there was a study of where they were attempting to reintroduce a lemur a couple of lemur individuals, I believe maybe from captivity, possibly in the US, to Madagascar. And they did a really wonderful article that broke down the logistics, the costs, and then it wasn't successful, right? And so I think I think that's a really tricky situation. The majority of in the US at least, right, that there are breeding programs for captive primates, but those are kept within zoo house management and not reintroduced into the wild. You know, most of the primate sanctuaries that I've had the opportunity to engage with over the years are struggling to manage the populations that they have and to find adequate reintroduction locations. So it's not something that I would personally support.
Great. Thank you very much, Diane. I hope that answered the question. Where are you now?
I think we have Marty Jasper wants to have a question now.
Yes,
If you,
yes, thank you, Rod.
Hey, Marty.
How's it, guys? Thanks, Carolyn, for a very interesting talk. I mean, I think a lot of emphasis was on education, which I think is great, and you guys are doing great work. But I think the one part, and it maybe is a difficult question, is actual ownership and benefit to the local communities, because as educated as you might be, and as much as you understand the important position of other primates and other biodiversity and whatever, if the person is hungry or has need, that's a huge issue. So I mean, I think actual ownership, I mean, very often people from Western countries are going to these places with no real needs in their lives, and the people that they're dealing with have massive needs. So I don't know if you want to elaborate on that.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really great point, and one that I guess is something that I internalize more. I often forget about, but you know, one thing that you can do sort of in part when you're thinking about education is sort of reframing the way, being aware of, right, why wildlife is important to me, and acknowledging that it's different for other individuals. And that, right, we had a long running campaign series where the images were wildlife is not only meat, right? It is meat. It has to be meat. I'm never going to go somewhere and tell people to stop eating primates when they've been eating it for thousands of years, right? It's understanding who's eating the meat in the community. You know, are you benefiting from your own forest, right? One community I work with in a past life, individuals were coming in from outside hunting and taking the meat out. In that case, right, the community is not necessarily benefiting from the meat themselves, right? And a lot of the work, and here's where integrated methods are really important and part of the work that Liz is doing for her PhD, and I did during my postdoc with my colleague, Dr. Melissa Remus, is through health measures and some of these studies of food security, you can really demonstrate to communities not only why that wildlife as meat is important to their health, right? When you can see in your body why the long-term sustainability of a population that's consumed, I guess, at a sustainable level can help to limit anemia, different sort of nutritional issues, right? So demonstrating, it's hard to demonstrate to someone how conservation matters to them, right? And when seeing it in your body is a different way. So conservation through health is a really important approach. You know, and one thing I also sort of have started doing personally is changing the way I show images, right? Generally, when I've in the past, probably even the last time I spoke with you all, showing images of dead non-human primates in a market, right? That changes the way everybody on this call sees the person who needs to eat that primate, right? So you see a lined up, you know, pile of monkey carcasses, and you think, how could you have a sort of, in anthropology, it's sometimes called like a disgust response of thinking about how you experience that image. And then you become removed from thinking about the person that needs that monkey meat to fill their cooking pot, right? So it's, you have to really challenge ourselves to find creative ways to do it. And so in education programs, we've done it in thinking about, acknowledging, doing an ecosystem approach. So we have, we've done posters that say, like, your wildlife is important for yourself, your wealth, your something, your health, right? Something like that rhymes, and shows through the system, right, that renewable energy allows for this. And then, masks are made from wood that are part of the, sort of demonstrating visually how culture and life are wrapped up in some of these areas. It's just a different way of looking at it. I don't know if that answers your question, but it is really important to demonstrate that the way that a local community member experiences and owns and engages with wildlife is different. I experienced it a lot as a student when I was in CAR studying dikers, and they assumed I would come there to study something else rather than small ungulates, because why would anybody care about that? Right? It's a species that's very important locally to people for their cooking pots, but had been less studied, right, by conservationists who'd come into the region.
No, thanks. I mean, I think it's a very real side of the whole discussion. So thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you, Marty. Also, we have Claudia Velasquez wants to ask a question, I believe.
Yes.
Claudia, do you want to?
Yes, can you hear me there?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. Carolyn, very interesting talk. I've been visiting Madagascar quite often, and it's quite scary to see the habitat is encroaching and the forest disappearing. It's so fast and so quick. And one of the biggest problems with all forest animals, but mostly for primates, is the destruction of the forest at such a fast rate. So my question is, do you know of any project which encourage community participation into restoration of forests to provide more habitat for animals, especially primates, that have actually been successful? I know that in some part of Africa, something like that have been done with chimpanzee, but I don't know if you know of any other one.
Oh, I wish I could say that I could think of them all to hand, but if I do, I can picture a few websites that I've been through where they're talking about doing forest restoration projects. Let me think about it. I'd be happy to email you. I know that some individuals in Madagascar have been doing some of that as sort of by sort of secondary aspects of their work. It's hard to know if it's being done at a scale that's really effective. It's not something I've really ever followed too much, but it is, right, a tangible way that communities could be engaged in conservation as well and advocacy. So it's something I'll check into. I wish I had an answer for you, but
yes, because I've seen similar projects where they're done here in South Africa, where the community worked with having nurseries of indigenous fruit plant or fruit trees that allow birds like parrot and obviously some mango monkeys to actually have more food. And in that case, they don't go to eat food that is actually detrimental to their health. So I don't know if there's something similar, but obviously, in Madagascar, I know how difficult it is. And it's just, it's happening very fast. When you see even Ranomafana, I was shocked to see already that some areas of the forest have been completely chopped on the top part of the mountain. And there are some very unique species there that really, they don't have a buffer zone. So is that what I'm obviously education is very important, but it's a long term. The short term that we're losing all this primate, it probably involves more looking very, very seriously at habitat restoration, or even not to lose so much of it.
Yeah, no, and I think that's something that's always right in at the forefront of conservation is how can we engage in, right, a lot of things have to happen very fast, but some of the most effective things happen slow. So how can we find some sort of point in the middle where we're able to move them both forward?
Thank you.
Claudio, I think earlier in these seasons of these talks, last year we had Mike Mills talking on habitats in Angola, bird threatened habitats, and he had started some projects to reforest some of the very threatened forest patches in Angola. And I think Dave Pepler talked about doing some forestry work in Tanzania, and another one of his talks also on this series that I can recall off the top of my head.
Sure, and it's an amazing opportunity to, if you have, for instance, school participating in something like that. I think that is also a very good tool to teach.
Rod, I've put the link to the talk by Dave Pepler in the chat.
Okay, thanks, Johan. Yeah, Mike Mills also covered something like that in his talk on Angola. Okay. Right, next up, I think, is Richard Mazabedi. Hello, Richard, how are you doing?
Hello, I'm doing fine. I hope I'm clear. My signal is not so stable. So my question is a follow-up to what Marty asked. I want to, here in Botswana, we have, our approach is to make the community have a sense of ownership to the wildlife, such that we have programs like a community-based natural resource management. Mm-hmm. Because if they don't feel a sense of ownership, they view these animals as government animals. But if they say they view them as their own, they use them sustainably, they try to conserve them too. So what are the, do you have a similar approach? And one of the things here, the approaches here, for example, is to have community trusts, with some of this money sponsoring some poor student locally. They feel that this is ours and it's benefiting, addressing some of our local needs. Mm-hmm. So do you have a similar approach for primates?
Yeah, so I can think of a few examples. So one that comes to mind is one of my research programs is in Southwest Cameroon, and we work there with the Korab Rainforest Conservation Society, which is a Cameroonian-based NGO that all of its members come from different, some are former hunters, they all come from different sort of levels of the community of all the villages living inside and outside of the protected area. And they've been really from the ground up, really good at, really successful in getting access to some fundings. And they've created a scholarship program that's to help students go to university. They did a sort of small scholarship program that was also really successful, where a number of students from this more rural protected area went to the main town of Limbe to visit the wildlife sanctuary, to learn about animals there and research. And so sort of doing some of these more exchange-based educational components where it's individuals from the community. And with those NGOs, right, and with some of the work that we do at Chingeta, working very closely with communities to sort of foster is not the right word, because there already is that sense of ownership, but to really acknowledge that the space belongs to those individuals, right? And that we're learning from it. And I think it's something that is done long-term, but in terms of sort of scholarships and access programs, that's a really good program that I've worked with in the past. I think you can't emphasize enough, right, the importance of these spaces to local people, because they are their spaces. And something that we focus on a lot in anthropology, particularly in what's called multi-species ethnography, where you're really demonstrating, right, I think I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, we've been saying that that hunting is unsustainable for 50 years, but the people are still hunting and there's still wildlife coming out of the forest. So we have to really, right, maybe it is unsustainable now, but it's sort of demonstrating to individuals that like at what point is there sustainability and unsustainability? Has it been that individuals have been managing their resources or not managing resources? And that people are quite capable, confident, and want to do these things, right? And so my job at, Partners for Red Colobus and Chingeta, our main goal is to work ourselves out of a job, right? Through capacity building and sort of reinvigorating some of these programs like you're talking about.
Thanks a lot. I just want to finish with sharing a small, not a small, something which was developing and it got interrupted by COVID-19. I come from a remote area, very close to wildlife conservation area. And one of the things in those villages, we like football. Our Christmas is like football. People dress nicely and go and enjoy local football. So the range managers, the managers there are sponsoring football tournaments. And by sponsoring these popular events and sharing conservation messages in those events, it's really, makes them realize that we are really getting nice things from our own resources nearby, and we have to conserve them. So that was something I was planning to start with the local managers in my area, my home village, and it got interrupted because now there's no football. So we are just waiting for COVID to go, and we might start something like that, getting the message to local communities by things that they like. Events.
Yeah, exactly. You're exactly right. Creating community-based events where you can sort of blend these things together. We're trying to do that also in another place, and also using handball for women who are more interested in that. It's a great idea, and I hope that you get the opportunity to do it.
Thank you.
So
I think the next question would be Andrew Mariti. Sorry, Ruan. Andrew Mariti from Gambia, from Banjul at the moment.
Yeah. Yes, thank you very much, Chris and Ruan. Thank you very much for this informative presentation, Caroline. As mentioned now, we are here in Gambia, but we are originally South Africans. My wife works for the United Nations here. So now, and we normally, travel a lot and so forth and so forth. But I must say, this is the home for the red colobus. And I don't want to be seen or to be heard to be repeating what other people already have said. But the conservation of the red colobus is in this area is influenced by cultural practices. Mm-hmm. And because the influence thereof, in other words, in some sense, is as a result of the standard of living of this area. Gambia is a very small country, very small, and its sources of income, productivity is mostly on ecosystems. Mm-hmm. So my question here, and as I said earlier on, I don't want to be repeating what other people have asked already. How can one approach that in that, you dispel that cultural practices in these species and then infect your education principles, education into changing people's minds, given their background economically. I don't know if in your education training or you know, booklets or whatever, you have come across that, or you have developed something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really difficult thing. You know, one of my personal mantras for my research and for in our education programs is that we can't change behavior, but we can shift perspectives. And so that, it's not the place of an education program or a conservationist to ask a community to change behaviors that are important to them that are part of their individual and community and collective identity. We can share different perspectives on the way that behavior impacts the environment or impacts a non-human primate species or impacts any wildlife, plant, or fish species, and just have those conversations. And I think when you approach individuals in that way, rather than coming at someone saying like, with this program, we're going to stop, interdict, change, limit what you're doing, that's just asking for a conflict, right? Or a place to butt heads, instead of presenting a way to provide an alternative perspective. I think is one way. And I think that's why it's really important to work with local community stakeholders that have that perspective, right? And generally when you're with other community members and they see you having an open and honest discussion about the importance of this, maybe a particular primate in a cultural ritual, or the particular primate in as a food source, that you can have conversations as to how that's important, and to share different examples, and to at least begin the discussion that way, if it makes sense.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Caroline.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Rod, I think we can give Judith Judith, your hand's been up for a while. There we go. Asking you to unmute. There we go.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I have to apologize because I'm very hard of hearing, so even Zoom isn't good for me. But my big question is, did I miss something, or was there a discussion about the fact that animals that are kept in sanctuaries can be released back into the wild, and that there's a problem with that? Because this is a big issue in South Africa and where I'm from. And I really don't believe that pretending that there's genetic purity in different populations in the country justifies not releasing animals that have been saved, rescued, rehabilitated into the wild is a good idea. I don't think it's right that pretending that we have to keep the genetic purity of a population should stop our humanitarian treatment of the animals.
Yeah, I think the question was more, should we be actively breeding captive populations for relief? Right. So absolutely, if there are many sanctuaries are overwhelmed with the numbers of species they have. And so, you know, there are ways to do safe and effective reintroductions that meet, you know, standards that are beyond sort of my knowledge scope. Yes. That is, you are correct. I do agree with you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Judith. Dr. Llewellyn Taylor, you're next. Asking you to unmute. There we go.
Hi, Carolyn. I'm just curious about civil wars and even internecine conflicts in Central Africa and various regions like that. To what extent does that impact on the survival of the primates in the areas? Because very often those primates are used for for nutritional needs for these warmongers, and I just don't know sometimes to what extent it's actually affecting those populations.
Yeah, I mean, so I can give you one example. You know, we're waiting to see, right? So in some of you may be, I assume, aware of right, the Francophone Anglophone crisis in southwest and northwestern parts of Cameroon. It's been since 2017 that any active research has been able to be done in Korup National Park, one of the last strongholds for Preuss's red colobus. And of course, also there's the mainland drill, and then the Nigerian Cameroon chimpanzee is also there. And so we don't know, right, in this particular circumstance what the outcome will be, and it's always a waiting game, I think. You know, where we've all sat, you know, and talked to our colleagues that are, you know, our friends at the Korup Rainforest Conservation Society that are still working with some of the community members, right? There's a lot of difficulty in being able to engage at any level in conservation at the moment. But right, that there, you know, are, you know, my gut reaction would have been that individuals there are communities that live in that forest. And so those communities who have been cut off from other access points, like for agricultural goods, would have to rely more on forest meat and forest products. But also then, you know, the other side of that was that there was bullets became very expensive and bullets weren't circulating. So then, you know, were hunters really able to get, you know, the munitions needed for hunting, right? And it's something that you can't really know until after the fact. You know, so in that case, you know, we're thinking terrain in this case might be important for the chimpanzees because they're up, you know, in this particular park. They stay around one sort of elevated sector, right, where people might not go. And so it is something that I think conservationists are always wary of, but it's also something that we acknowledge as being beyond our control.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Llewellyn. Good question. Any other questions? No one has a hand up or waving, or Rod, if you can see anyone, that would be great.
No, I can't see anybody. I would just like to say thank you to Caroline for using Southwest Cameroon as your example of civil war and not Sanga.
Well, I know you're reopening, so I wanted to draw focus somewhere else.
Thank you.
Lovely. Any other, I mean, if you have any answers or questions or any, I mean, a reply even, just wave at us and we'll give you a chance.
If it's okay, I'm going to share one last thing on my screen that I forgot.
Yes, by all means, by all means.
As an educator, I feel like I have to. Can you see it? Here's your reading list.
Yes, yeah. Oh, there we go. Let's see. And you can add in the chat section, ladies and gentlemen, those of you who have read any of these.
just in case. And then I was compelled to put one of my own articles in there when I saw there wasn't one, but
you had to.
Yeah.